At its face, Peter Pan is a strange, but pretty innocuous story of a boy who just doesn't want to grow up. But what if I told you that this seemingly innocent tale was born out of the mind of a pedophile? A man who was so awful he stole 5 boys and tortured them physically and mentally to the point that at least 2 of them would take their lives. What if this man built the story of Peter Pan around his own life, and the heinous acts Peter engages in are a loose metaphor for what the author did to these children? Born in 1860, Barrie grew up entirely in the shadow of his older brother, who his mother adored. Sadly though, in 1867, Barrie's brother David collided with someone while ice skating, cracked his head on the ice, and died, forever becoming the boy who would never grow up. Barrie's childhood was rocked once more when his mother went insane. In an attempt to hold on to the little memory she had of her dead son, Barrie's mother would dress him up in his brother David's clothes so she could have him back, even if just for a brief moment. These early experiences were the beginning of Barrie's infatuation with childhood innocence and the idea of never growing up. Eventually, Barrie would leave home, graduate from the University of Edinburgh in 1882, and begin working as a journalist while writing novels on the side. In 1894, he married an actress named Mary Ansell, but from night one, the marriage was ill-fated. However, for Barrie, who was stuck in a semi-childlike state, these were great years. He published a number of books and became a popular author. But the story that made him an authorial icon would see its inception in 1902, when he published The Little White Bird, where we see the first references to Peter Pan. We won't get too much into that story since it's pretty irrelevant except for a few things. What you should know is that the story shows Barrie's obsession with a group of boys he met in Kensington Garden, and it is the first reference to Peter Pan. We'll get more into the boys in the next section, but before then, we must cover Barrie's divorce. After 15 years, Mary Ansell would begin hoeing out with one of Barrie's close friends. Barrie begged her to stop, and she begged for a divorce. Divorce was nearly impossible at this time, but in Mary's case, the church actually gave her an annulment because the marriage was never, not in 15 years, consummated. When word got out about this, Barrie was incredibly embarrassed, but taking everything into consideration, it's not actually that surprising. The man was obsessed with childhood, and despite being a middle-aged man, couldn't give up his last bit. So as the natural result of his impotence, he turned to another family and sought to make it his own. As I briefly mentioned earlier, there was a formative event in 1897 that inspired the creation of Peter Pan and destroyed the lives of an entire family. That was the day Barrie met the 5 Llewellyn Davies boys. In order, they are George, John, also known as Jack, Peter, Michael, and Nicholas. On that fabled day in 1897, Barrie met George and Jack, who were walking through Kensington Garden with their nanny Mary. Barrie seemed fatefully attracted, and I mean that in every sense of the word, to these little boys, and struck up a, heavily air-quoted, friendship. He began to spend time with the boys regularly without their mother Sylvia's knowledge. In fact, Sylvia wouldn't even know that Barrie knew her children until a year later when her and Barrie randomly met at a dinner party. That he introduced himself to her by saying he knew her children already. I can't imagine how that wouldn't alarm a mother, but apparently it didn't. Now with a green light from Sylvia, Barrie suddenly could spend effectively as much time with the children as he pleased, and quickly gained the nickname Uncle Jimmy. In 1907, the father died, and in 1910, she would die. While on her deathbed, she requested that Barrie transcribe a letter to the boy's grandmother. The letter was meant to read as follows. What I would like would be if Jenny would come to Mary, and the 2 together would be looking after the boys and the house. Mary was the boy's nanny who first met Barrie in Kensington Garden, and Jenny was her sister. However, what the letter actually ended up saying was a little bit different. The letter read as follows. What I would like would be if Jimmy would come to Mary and the 2 together would be looking after the boys and the house. Meaning that once the boy's mother died, they would be completely trapped in the evil hands of Barrie. The grandmother knew Barrie was a family friend and didn't second guess Sylvia's letter, which meant that Barrie became their guardian and trustee, or in other words, their de facto dad. Losing their mother and falling into the hands of Barrie was a dark turning point for Michael and Peter, who were Barrie's favorites. While as far as I'm aware, there are no first-person accounts from the boys, we can read the original Peter Pan and get a pretty solid idea of the things these boys endured. For context, modern adaptations of Peter Pan are derived from Barrie's Peter Pan and Wendy, which is a horrifying book with so many things that will leave your jaw on the floor that I don't have time to get into all of them here. Thus, I'm going to pick the 5 that stood out to me the most. Firstly, the name Peter Pan is derived from Peter Davies and Pan. Pan is known as the ancient god of fertility, in air quotes, but a more accurate title would be the god of rape, both human and animal, and just about anything else awful you can imagine. There's actually a famous statue of him in an Italian villa pinning a goat down and violently raping it. Like, you can't make this up. Additionally, part of the modern interpretation of what Satan looks like is derived from depictions of Pan. Seems like an interesting choice for a children's character, but it only gets worse from here. In the story, Peter sits at the foot of Wendy's bed every night and plays his flute for her while she sleeps. Wendy has no idea he's actually there and just thinks she's dreaming. Going back into legend, Pan, the god of rape, would play his flute to sow chaos, which Barrie lovingly depicts in his book. Peter Pan's goal in playing his flute for Wendy is to lure her into a false sense of comfort, kidnap her, and take her away to Neverland. In Neverland, Peter has a group of children that serve as everything from his army to his playthings, but like everyone in Neverland, they never actually grow old. Well, not exactly. Every one of Peter's Lost Boys grows, just not old. They're all young because the boys on the island vary, of course, in numbers, according as they get killed and so on. And when they seem to be growing up, which is against the rules, Peter thins them out. And that's a direct quote from the mind of Barrie. I bet those boys wanted to grow up. But we're not done with the Lost Boys yet. Peter, like any kid, likes to play make-believe. Except in Peter's world, he plays make-believe feeding the Lost Boys food, and will starve the children, insisting that they pretend his fake food is feeding them, even if they haven't eaten for days or weeks. And get this, if someone complains, they are beaten. In the film, the kids return home just in time to get back into bed before the parents come home from their date night, meaning that time in Neverland operates completely different than in reality. And at this point, you shouldn't even be surprised when I tell you that that's a complete rewrite from the original. In Peter Pan and Wendy, the parents are outside their home when they see a burst of light and a bunch of shadows in their nursery. The father runs upstairs with the mother right behind him, only to find that all of their kids are gone. They begin crying since their children have been kidnapped and are probably dead now. In fact, Barrie seemed to get pleasure out of this idea, so he included a drawing of what this looked like to him. And including that little fact makes the story quite a bit darker. This part is reminiscent of the idea that no one ever escapes Peter Pan, a fate that both Michael and Peter Davies learned in the most unfortunate way. In a final chapter written for the original text that Barrie removed and then re-added in later publications, he writes that Peter returns for Wendy much later on, only to find that she has betrayed him by growing up. By growing up, Peter means that Wendy's now become a mother, and as punishment for becoming a mom, Peter takes Wendy's daughter Jane to become his new mom in Neverland. Unlike Wendy, the story doesn't go into depth about Jane, but we do know that eventually she returns, and it's really left up to our imaginations what horrifying things happen to her alone in that strange place. But it doesn't end there. In the last few sentences of this chapter, Barrie adds that Jane grows up by becoming a wife and a mother, thereby betraying Peter, at which point he takes Jane's child, Margaret, to Neverland. It seems like terrorizing this family once wasn't enough, and like a demon, Peter plagues this family endlessly, stealing their children so long as they are what Barrie calls gay and innocent and heartless. For Barrie, there were two boys who would never outgrow their heartlessness, so they got to meet the real Peter Pan. The following are the true stories of Michael and Peter, two kids that couldn't outrun the boy who wouldn't grow up. The first story is of Michael Llewellyn Davies. Barrie admits that Michael was his favorite child, and reading his letters, he definitely makes that clear. The following is a letter Barrie wrote for Michael on his 8th birthday. I wish I could be with you and your candles. You can look on me as one of your candles, the one that burns badly, the greasy one that is bent in the middle. But still, hooray! I am Michael's candle. I wish I could see you putting on the redskin clothes for the first time. Dear Michael, I am very fond of you, but don't tell anybody. Okay, that was gross. Talk about getting caught in 4K. But what makes this even worse is to think that 2 years after this letter was written, he gained full custody of these boys, meaning that Michael spent 8 years living with a man who wrote him letters like this. It's revolting to imagine what was being done physically. For Michael, his only hope at normalcy was escape. He headed to Oxford College, hoping to finally be free of Barrie. However, the letters would begin arriving shortly after Michael did, and a friend at the time, by the name of Robert Boothby, reported in an interview in 1976 that he thought Michael and Barrie's relationship was morbid and unhealthy. This morbid and unhealthy relationship definitely took its toll. During his stay at Oxford, Michael grew close to Rupert Buxton, another lost soul. The two made a suicide pact. And on May 19th, 1921, Michael and Robert headed down to a well-known and incredibly dangerous pool of water to see it through. And they were successful in their attempt, perishing shortly after. But what makes this story even sadder is that in the police report, it says that their bodies were found clasped to one another, meaning they had held one another down beneath the water so neither could escape, effectively guaranteeing their demise. In an interview much later on, the remaining brothers would say that they were certain it was a suicide. Their brother died at the age of 20, only 1 month shy of his 21st birthday. Sadly, this trend does not end with Michael. It continues on to Peter, who despite his early death is immortalized in the name of his torturer's greatest creation. Peter absolutely loathed Peter Pan. Throughout his life, he refused to call it Peter Pan and instead would refer to it as that terrible masterpiece. As an adult, he did everything he could to outrun it, but the story stuck to him like glue. After decades of suffering, Peter began the perilous road to the bottom of the bottle, a road that would culminate in a final walk. On the spring night of April the 5th, 1960, Peter left the Royal Court Hotel bar, stumbling his way along the pavement to the Sloane Square subway station, where he proceeded to walk off the subway platform onto the tracks as a train was pulling into the station. His death was instantaneous. It makes my heart ache to think that if Mary Hodgson had taken a different route through the garden that day, or the family had lived in a different part of London, they may never have met Barrie. All in all, these are heartbreaking deaths for a couple of boys who wanted to grow up but just couldn't escape their childhood. So what are we left with? Is Peter Pan just a classic tale, or is it something more? After making this video, I can't help but see it as some sort of confession. And by confession, I mean that it's a thinly veiled metaphor written by a sick man describing the various ways by which he destroyed the lives of 5 young boys, causing 2 of them to commit suicide. But whether or not we see eye to eye on that, after watching this video, I can assure you of one thing. You will never see Peter Pan in the same light again. I really appreciate all you guys for watching, and I just absolutely cannot wait for the next video. Thank you so much for all your support. The channel's growing like crazy. And until next time, just remember, the things that we take for granted as children are often the strangest ones.